Okay, we're going to start assembling the engine now. So the first thing, I've got the engine completely stripped down. We've already deglazed the cylinders and everything's cleaned up. It's all ready to go back together. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to put the bearings back in place. Now, if you look at the way I've got things organized over here on the bench, I've got everything laid out in order that I took it out of, so that all the bearings go back in the same place, all the caps go back on the same place, and everything. So even over on that table there, I've got everything laid out. So what we're going to do is we're going to start assembling it back together. So on a main bearing, these are the main bearings, and on the main bearings you see these little holes in here. Those are for oil, and so you've got oil passages we talked about in one of the chapters. Oil that passes through passages in the oil engine block comes in here. It comes in this groove. This is an oil groove to lubricate these bearings. And if you notice, it has a keeper on it. The other side, no keeper. And so the way to install these bearings is you just put the keeper right in place, just like that, to where it's right level with the journal there, and then just push down on the other side. And that installs both of those, or both ends of the journal. Now you do have a thrust bearing on here, and if you notice on this one here, these are the thrust. A lot of engines, this thrust sleeve is actually part of the bearing, but on these Spark engines, they just go on the side here, like that. So when you take the engines apart, you need to make sure you don't lose those. And we're just going to go through and we're going to put all of the bearings back into the engine block. Like so. And it looks like I got them off just once, because I've got to start over here. I didn't do that. So I'm going to shut the camera off and I'm going to fix it. Now remember, when you're assembling these engines, everything needs to be really clean. We're going to use some Lubriplate, which is the really lightweight. I've talked about this before. This is the first time I showed you though. But we're just going to use some Lubriplate, and we're going to lubricate each one of the bearings, and just make sure that they all have some really good lube on there, because you don't want to start these engines up dry when you first start them up after you've overhauled them. And so Lubriplate's kind of nice, because especially if you're not going to install the engine right away. If you're going to install the engine right away, you can go ahead and use like engine oil or a thicker oil, you know, like an assembly lube or STP or something like that. Yeah, like this assembly fluid here. You can use that if you need to, if you're going to run the engine right away. So now that I've got all the journals, or all the main bearing halves in there, we're going to set the crankshaft down in here. You have to be careful when you do this so that you don't nick the crankshaft. So be very gentle when you set this down in. It would be a shame to do all this work and then damage the crankshaft when you're setting it down in the engine. So you set it down in here like so. I usually just rock it back and forth a little bit, making sure that none of the bearings pop up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the main bearing caps, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a little bit of lube on those. So I usually just squirt a little bit on my finger and then lubricate the bearing itself. Now when you put these together, see the little keeper on the bearing half in the cap? Keeper here matches up with the keeper down here. And also, when you're installing these, you want to make sure that the arrow is pointing towards the front of the engine. And so what I do is I usually set all the caps on there and then tighten the bolts down just so they don't come off. And then we'll go to the next step. I'm going to tighten up the rods, or the main bearing caps, and I usually just start in the middle. And I'm just going to tighten them down just snug. I'll go back and torque them later. But I'm just going to go through and just retorque or tighten them down just one at a time. Okay, we're going to torque the main bearing caps now. And so you have to set the torque wrench. And if you've never used a torque wrench like this before, this is one that you set by twisting the handle. And the torque is measured on this, or written on the side here. And this is, these main bearing caps are torqued to 22 foot-pounds plus 30 degrees. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So here's the 20 foot-pounds right there. So I'm going to turn this until this just shows up at 20. Let's see. So there's my 0 mark right there on this, and then so I'm down below the 20, so I need to rotate it around one full turn till I come up to 0 again. Now I'm right at 20. So on this one here I need to go over 2 more foot-pounds. So there's a half, there's 1, 1.5, and 2 foot-pounds. And this right here is a locking bar. Whoops. So you twist this to lock it. Now you can't twist the handle so you don't mess up your torque. Okay, so this is at 22 foot-pounds. So we're going to start torquing right here, and this is a clicker type torque wrench, and so when we get to the right torque you'll hear it click. And I'm going to see if I can do this right there. So that's the right torque. So we're going to go through and we're going to torque them all to 22 foot-pounds, then we'll go back and do the degrees. Okay, we're going to set with the torque spec calls for 22 foot-pounds plus an additional 30 degrees. So I've got a degree wheel set up here, and we're going to torque the main bearing cap to an additional 30 degrees. We've already torqued it to 22 foot-pounds. And so as we move the torque wrench, you see the needle move. We're going to go to 30 degrees right there, and that's tight. Now the way I set this up is, if you notice, I'm not using a ratchet, I'm using a breaker bar. That's usually the best tool to use on that. And then the way this is set up, this is just an adapter that you put the socket on the bottom. So it's a 1/2 inch. So you put the socket on the bottom, and then this little guy here you can adjust. So you put it on, and then you kind of spin it around and find something for it to hit up against, and then you can tighten it down like that. And then once you've got it solid so that it's not going to move, then you can move the outer ring around and bring your pointer up to 0, and then you put your wrench on there and twist it around to 30 degrees. And so we're going to put an additional 30-degree spin on each one of the main bearing caps. All the main bearing caps are torqued, and everything still spins free. It's important to check that every once in a while when you're assembling an engine, just to make sure that nothing gets bound up, so you don't have to, it'd kind of be a drag to get the engine all the way assembled and then it doesn't turn over, and then you've got to go back and find out why. So, but this spins nice and free. All the main bearing caps are torqued to spec. So now the next thing is to install the pistons.